Hi, this is Paul. I spent yesterday working on a big video. What is a Christian? I haven't recorded anything yet. I was just working on the PowerPoint. It's a big, big project. I'll have to see if it ever bears fruit. But it very much flows out of the little off the cuff video I did, Who's a Better Christian, Jordan Peterson or John Vervaeke, and some of the off the cuff comments that came at. There's sort of a YouTube as Twitter with when you entitle something. Um, I gotta check the sound levels. Okay, sound levels seem okay. So the conversation that Nick and John Vervaeke had for the Q&A last Friday was absolutely tremendous. I was so gratified by that. And we've got some other guests coming up in Bridges of Meaning for some of these. I've got some vacation coming, and so I won't be around, and so we've got some other pinch hitters coming up, and hopefully they'll hit better than I do. And so looking forward to some of those. I was so happy with the conversation with John, and Nick just did an unbelievable job. One of the things that so my conversations with John have been prompting me is to think about this word theism. And I don't remember if it was Nate or someone else recently in a conversation basically said, well, that word theism isn't really very old. And I thought, there's all these things out there that you just live in this world with this word theism and you don't think anything of the word or how it's used. And theism sort of just becomes, a Christian word. Or if you're a Christian, you're a theist, et cetera, et cetera. And it got me thinking, well, what about that word? And so then you just throw it into Google and origin, theism, Greek theos, yeah, God, I know that one. English ism. That's where the word comes from. Late 17th century. Ooh, that's really suspicious. Then cruise over to the Wikipedia page, which was decent. The term theism derives from the Greek theos, or theoi, meaning God or gods. The term theism was first used by Ralph Cudworth, and I thought, I've never heard of this guy. See, I'm not a philosopher. My background in philosophy is not that good. Ralph Cudworth, 1617 to 1680 to 1688. Now that's a really suspicious time period. That's basically 100 years after the Protestant Reformation. Now we're getting into the 17th century, and a lot of things get really interesting and sort of wonky in the 17th century, including Calvinism to a degree. And so what's going on philosophically? What's going on under the surface at that point? In Cudworth's definition, they are strictly and properly called theists who affirm that a perfectly conscious understanding being, a mind, and this gets into this conversation that, where Vervaeke comes up and says, is God a being? And this gets into my conversation with Brett Sockold. God is not inside the system. And this gets into the question of sacraments, because of course Sockold was writing transubstantiation. This gets into all of these philosophical assumptions, and not just as philosophical assumptions, they're these picture-thinking assumptions about the world, and then these language systems that somehow intersect with these pictures in our mind. And this gets into the cognitive science and the exaptation and all of the ways that, and you think about C.S. Lewis writing in his book Miracles about what he thinks London is. And so, that just sort of drove me in further because I'm a digger. So that, of course, sent me to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. English philosopher Ralph Cudworth, 1618 to 1688, defies classification within customary categories of the history of philosophy. Well, that's interesting. At the time when mainstream philosophers announced their modernity by breaking with the past, Cudworth is a figure of continuity, steeped in ancient philosophy, yet abreast in contemporary philosophy and science. He shared his anti-scholastic agenda with self-styled modernizers like Bacon, Hobbes, and Descartes, with whose philosophy he engaged, but framed his most original ideas by recourse to antiquity. Cudworth is usually regarded as a Cambridge Platonist, though he himself would not have recognized the label. Although he is normally classified as a rationalist, it has become increasingly apparent that this designation is based on too limited a view of his philosophical writings. And it sounds like basically his philosophical writings are, he's, I felt that when I read this, I felt a degree of camaraderie with the dude as someone who puts out way too many videos for any reasonably important person to watch it. I do not mean to, insult my audience, mind you, because my videos are things you listen to as you go to bed or you wash the dishes or my videos are not the subject of academic inquiry. And I am totally good with that. In fact, I'm happy about that because my videos are me talking to you about things I'm thinking about and you enjoying it. And, I get calls from people sometimes who watch, 20 or 30% of my videos. And that's totally cool because who could watch them all? And as some of you have. And again, I applaud you for that and I celebrate you. And there are other voluminous video makers like, friends of mine like Byrne and like Karen, and I don't watch all their videos. Even Peugeot, I miss bunches of Peugeot's videos and Peterson. So anyway, it sounds like this dude was basically doing this to his audience with his works, which he never finished. They're all written posthumously, and hardly anybody's ever read them. And I went to Amazon. You can find hard copies of them for, $30-$40 a thing. But I thought, I'm not going to buy them because I'm not going to read them. I have to find them on the internet somewhere. But here's Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy should at least give me a place to start. Anyway, Cudworth's written output was substantial, but much of it was never published, and his philosophical system is incomplete. Man after my own heart. Broadly, his philosophy combines Platonist ethics and metaphysics with an atomist natural philosophy. Well, that's interesting. He is chiefly remembered for his epistemological nativism and his ethical idealism. Distinctive elements of his philosophy include his theory of consciousness and unconsciousness, his conception of free will as a power of self-determination, and his causal hypothesis of what he calls the plastic power of nature. The immense humanist learning which fills his published writings has tended to obscure his achievements as a philosopher in post-humanist times. That's Renaissance humanist. Or early modern, let's say. But it did not prevent him from having a considerable legacy in 18th and 19th century philosophy. And you scroll down. And you begin to realize that part of what this guy did was basically take a lot of this stuff and put English words on it. Hence, something like theism. You take the Greek word and you put the English ism on, and here we have this term, and it's a being, and so suddenly triggers God number one, God number two, meta-divine realm, all of these things that I tend to think about. Cudworth's legacy of bulky and incomplete writings testifies to his comprehensive knowledge of both ancient and contemporary philosophy. He subscribed to the Renaissance view of philosophy as Philosophia perennial philosophy, which presupposes a single timeless core of philosophical truth, which is the shared goal of both ancient and modern philosophical inquiry. Heir to the Renaissance humanist recovery of almost the entire corpus of ancient philosophy known today, his recourse to antique learning, especially to the philosophy of Plato and Plotinus, another known suspect in our little corner of the universe, but also Stoicism. In many ways, a typical humanist is in many ways a typically humanist move to ground authority in the tried and tested philosophy of ancient philosophers, Aspelin and Sellars, another known suspect. However, he turned to ancient philosophy, especially Greek philosophy, as a fund of pre-scholastic philosophical ideas and a source of a new conceptual vocabulary. And vocabulary is what we're looking at. As one of the first to write philosophy entirely in English, he coined many new terms, many of them adapted from Greek, like theism, even though that doesn't get a mention here. Some have not stood the test of time, while others, Cartesian, self-determinism, consciousness. Why haven't we heard of this guy? Are common currency in English philosophy as to this today. At the same time, his philosophy was deeply influenced by contemporary philosophy, especially Cartesianism. He had high regard for Descartes as an acute philosopher, and his philosophy registers the impact of Descartes in multifarious ways. He admired Cartesianism as a system of philosophy contains physics with metaphysics, which posited both corporeal and incorporeal substance. There we get into our dual substances. Lost my way here. Oh, there we are. He accepted clear and distinct perception as the criterion for epistemological certainty and the Cartesian account of sense perception. Sensation for Cudworth, as for Descartes, is a passion of the soul, at best a confused perception. He embraced both the idea of consciousness and the idea of God as a fully perfect, self-existent being, and adopted Descartes' conception of body as inert extension. However, he was highly critical of Descartes on many counts. He denied that mechanical rules of impact were sufficient to explain natural causality, and criticized Descartes' repudiation of final causes. He critiques Descartes' proof of the existence of God from his idea as circular, and his voluntarist conception of God as conducive to skepticism. He rejects Descartes' machine model of animals and denied that conscious cogitation exhausted the properties of immaterial substance. And then it goes on from there. And I thought, well, this is an interesting guy to figure out, and I started looking up theism and its origin because listening to John Vervaeke answer this question. So let's dive into the video. And it's not getting any sound. Okay, got it working again.
Oh, from Richard, we have you briefly mentioned with Jordan Peterson why you select the term non-theist, and it having to do with dismantling assumptions baked into the theist-atheist dichotomy. As many have said, your most recent conversation with Rafe Kelly...
Now, atheist, this is all tied together in this language.
Kelly was a nice follow-up to Peterson, largely because you dive into those assumptions quite deeply. Can you Can you succinctly lay out the frame that modernism and postmodernism is trapped into, and explain how that relates to atheism, theism, and non-theism? And I actually have a slight follow-up question to this, which would be, how do you separate out non-theism from something like apophatic theology?
So I'll answer the first question first, although I want to indicate right from the beginning, I think the second question is deeply pertinent, and I think it is pretty much almost entailed by any answer I give to the first question. So thank you for putting them together like that. That's helpful to me, because that way I can look forward. So what is shared about modernism and postmodernism is... That's a hard topic. But the shared presuppositions are largely those of modernity. I think it's correct and important to see postmodernism as a culminating critique of modernity. When I mean the ideological worldview framework that was given to us in the Enlightenment in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Basically by the 3 R's, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution. Right? And so what modernity is an affirmation of both the necessity and sufficiency of a bunch of claims. primarily, these claims are claims of this kind of set of ideas. I'm trying to not use jargon as much as I possibly can. But one set of ideas is the idea of that truth is accessible by the application of a method, not through a rational method, not through the personal transformation of the knower. So the knower, so if you compare...
Now he offers a dichotomy. One might ask, are those the only two items on the menu? But he's offering this dichotomy, which is right. I'm not quibbling with what he's saying here, but wanted to put that in there.
Personal transformation of the knower. So the knower, so if you compare, let's say, Augustine to Descartes, and that's a fair comparison because they share a lot of similar arguments, as many people pointed out to Descartes.
It'll go back to what he just said there about the personal transformation of the knower, because that obviously is a piece of what his conversation was with Peterson. But when another one of the elements that we've been looking at quite often is sort of the view from the inside versus the view from the outside. Back to C.S. Lewis's Reflections from a Tool Shed, where when you're seeing through the light, it's one thing. When you're looking at the light from outside of it, it's another. And we've looked at this inside-outside perspective quite a bit lately. When you're in love, you have access to a certain kind of knowledge and knowing that you don't have access to when you're not in love. Love has its own reasons. We say things like that because there's all these different ways of knowing. If you're inside of a family, you see things and you know things inside that family, and there's a certain kind of knowledge that you have, and these gets into his other 3 R's. Strawn is warning me about too tightly gripping these other 3 R's as opposed to the other. And I think John is right in that the 3 and the 1 are, in fact, it's not just 1 and 3. All 4 of them are tightly intertwined, and they're all working together in different ways. But, for example, being in love is a flow state. And I remember, I can't speak for everyone, but I remember, probably, you have crushes and stuff when you have a kid, but the first time you fall in love, and it's reciprocated, and you go into this thing that you've never done before. I mean, it's a flow state. It takes you over, and there's a reason that ancients described this as a very spiritual thing, because the spirit, Cupid, comes up and possesses you, and you become a different person, this transformation. So again, John's talking about these transformations. Now, obviously, the Enlightenment majors in, okay, there's this transcendent, this monarchical vision, this view from nowhere. We're going to take yourself out of this, and we're going to, as sort of a therapist sitting with let's say doing family therapy or something, and having an objective view of the marriage. What is this objective view? Well, this is a view quite intentionally from outside.
In this time, compare transformation of the knower, rational method, not through the personal transformation of the knower. So the knower, so if you compare, let's say, Augustine to Descartes, and that's a fair comparison because they share a lot of similar arguments.
I'm going to have to look into that because I've never looked at those two. I don't know Descartes. Oh, gosh, the problem with this is I sit and I learn from these people. It's, gosh, I don't know enough about Descartes. Gosh, I've never heard of this Cudworth fella. I don't have enough time to read all this stuff. I don't even have enough time to listen to all these videos. But here we are.
As many people pointed out to Descartes in his time. So it's a fair comparison. But if you compare them, right, you see that Augustine is basically arguing individuals have to go through this fundamental transformation, and only after they do that will certain truths be disclosed to them. At least that's how I interpret Augustine.
And So I'm a pastor, so I spend a lot more time reading the Bible than I do reading philosophy. And, again, obviously Augustine is getting this from somewhere, like the Bible.
Whereas Descartes says, no, you don't have to go through any transformation. All you need to do is use this method, and he's very, very confident in this method. This method will give you access to all truths, all the truths of the universe, all the truths of God, all the truths of humanity. And it's a very powerful confidence. That confidence is born out of another presupposition, assumption of postmodernism that becomes a presupposition in postmodernity, which is a deeply entrenched nominalism. And nominalism is the idea, I'm trying not to use too much, I'm trying not to use...
And again, nominalism has been a baddie around, guys like Rod Dreher and, people who, there's a lot of people who've been complaining about nominalism for a while now.
Too much, sorry. But nominalism is the idea coming from Duns Scotus and Occam. I talk about this a bit in my series. And this is where Jonathan is more radical than people realize, Jonathan Pageau. Because nominalism claims basically there are no real patterns. Right? There are no real patterns. The patterns are only patterns in our mind. Our mind is what links things together and makes the patterns. All that's out there are raw, absurd individuals, absurd in the very technical sense of absurd. Like they have, ultimately in themselves, they have no categorical meaning.
See, the beauty of interrupting is, I shouldn't, complain about Jordan Peterson interrupting John Vervaeke when I just do it again and again and again in my videos. But, what occurs to me, and to what degree is this, is what he just laid out in terms of Descartes and nominalism, to what degree are these things indispensable to the totalizing of the scientific method that we have seen over the last, say, the culmination of modernity?
There are no universals, all that kind of stuff. And see, once you think that, then you're put in this very weird position where all that the patterns are just in your mind, and then you just have to get them to rationally cohere with each other. The mind, somehow the patterns are real in your mind, and the mind knows them directly, but there's no patterns in the world, and the mind doesn't know them. And so a powerful dualism opens up between the mind and the world. And you're going to get Descartes and Kant coming out of all of that. Right. Now, what happens in the Enlightenment is the idea, wait. And it's a really weird thing that comes through Galileo, because Galileo brings some Platonism in a weird way to address the nominalism. I think his instinct is right. I think ultimately Platonism is what you need to address nominalism. But what Galileo says is math is the language of the universe. So for everything else, we have nominalism, but math actually finds the real patterns, right? And people have to appreciate that special privilege because the people in the Enlightenment thought they had a response to nominalism, which was that math seemed to track the new emerging empirical science, experimental science, and the new astronomy. And so it was like, but there is a language of the universe. That's what Galileo called it, and that's math. And that's why you've got the prioritization of math, and then everything tries to imitate math. So we get the idea of knowledge as a formal system, right? A formal logical mathematical system. So a purely structural, as the postmodernists will later say, because they also call themselves post-structuralists, this purely formal structure, and all we're going for is logical coherence. And then that brings the third thing, which is reason is nothing but logic. Reason is nothing but logic.
Now, if you've listened to 50 Hours of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, this all is fairly easy to follow, and this makes, I think, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis easier to follow too, because he nicely, succinctly kind of brings these things together. And if you've watched Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, many of these pieces were in it.
Okay, so all of those three actually fit together very, very profoundly, if you think about it.
Now we're in, just to track it, now we're in like Kripke, Hilbert the formalists pre-Gödel, basically.
Yep, and also you can even see that in people like Levi-Strauss in anthropology, where you have structuralism within anthropology, and you're trying to understand culture as a purely formal system, or what's going to be crucial for a lot of the postmodernists is you have Saussure and linguistic, who sees language as a purely formal system. That's why he constantly uses the analogy of chess to explain language, because chess is a prototypically formal system. What do I mean by a formal system? The chess pieces don't have any meaning in relation to the world. They only have a meaning that I assign to them within the game. And that's only a meaning of how they function with respect to each other. It's a purely formal, purely self-contained, possessing no intrinsic meaning, and that I only give it as I play with it and manipulate it and use it.
Now, the conversation that dropped yesterday was Peterson with Lawrence Krauss, and I'm looking forward to hearing that. I only began it because I don't have hours in a day just to do this thing. But the clip that showed up on Twitter was all about a section where they get talking about meaning, so this is going to be interesting.
And you see what a notion of language and culture and reason and knowledge you get from this.
Right.
Okay, so that's modernity, right? And there's more to it, but and what postmodernism does is it basically comes and said, and basically it's bound to it, because what it does is it critiques it. So let's go the other way. So is language a formal system? The deep answer is no. The deep answer is no. This is why the problem of getting real meaning into AI, right? This is the Chinese room problem and a whole bunch of other problems for those of you who know philosophy. The problem of getting meaning, not for us as we use it like a chess piece, the computer, but meaning that would be meaning for the computer even if all of us disappeared.
And that move right there is such an interesting one, because and we're so adept, if we're watching ourselves make this move that he just made, imagine I'm the computer. That's an interesting move, because we can do it, or we think we can do it, and we all seem to have the same ideas as we do it. I'm tracking with him, I'm agreeing with him, I'm not critiquing him at all in there, but just that little move that we make, what a strange creature we are. Imagine I'm that computer, because what do I know as that computer? And we sort of know that because we, of course, are the maker of the computer. And when we do things with the computer, we're surprised what the computer doesn't know. Between the DR and Sacramento, I spent a little bit of time, needed a little job to make some money. And so I was helping out with a place in Grand Rapids that they were trying to get all of their therapists to keep their notes on computer, and that the organization at that point in the 90s was trying to scale up and get people on computer, and I knew PCs, and so I did a little training work for them. Because I could both speak computer and I could speak therapist and human, and so I would try to get these therapists to learn how to use Windows and Word and it was amazing. Get this document into the computer, and they'd push pieces of paper onto, well, there's a hole, maybe I stick it in that hole, and it's not the way it's gonna go. But again, you don't know what you know until you watch someone who doesn't know it. So we're bizarre creatures.
Trying to get that philosophy. The problem of getting meaning, not for us as we use it like a chess piece, the computer, but meaning that would be meaning for the computer even if all of us disappeared.
And when we're talking about meaning at that point, what kind of thing are we talking about? And this is where so Lawrence Krauss in that little tidbit from Twitter, basically says, no, we can engineer our own meaning. And it's like, I'm not sure that that's what meaning is. And it's where Peterson sort of contests him on it, because the whole business about, well, we're in some ways as human beings, the big fight between, let's say, Christians, I'm going to use that word because I'm not going to use theists, because that's not germane to it. I'm trying to use some relevance realization between a Christian narrative and people who are skeptical about the Christian narrative, let's say, is a big part of this is that Christians believe that immense amounts of our meaning derives from the ways that the actions in this one silo will impact actions in, let's say, the life to come. And that seems analogous to us and the computer. The computer has no meaning. This language has no meaning inside itself because the computer, it seems to have meaning. We need to be able to cross into other worlds, as it were, or cross over boundaries and sort of begin to assimilate one world into the next.
Trying to get that into has proved to be a tremendous problem. So I want to make it clear that this argument isn't just coming out of the postmodernists, but what they basically said is, right, so Derrida, his central notion of difference, right, he assumes that Saussure is right about sort of syntax and semantics, and then says, but notice every term has its meaning not just in terms of a structure, but I'm always moving from one term to another. That's the deferring. And then what I'm noting is the difference between them, the contrast. So you combine deferring and differing to get difference. And what he says, I think completely correctly, is that can't be captured in the formal structure. Because every time I try to capture it with the formal structure, I'm just replicating the problem. And that's why you can't sort of get outside of this problem in an important way. Now, for me, I think that's an important point to make. Now, here's what I'm going to say, and I think I could even make some textual arguments about this, given his debate with John Searle and others, but I'll just make it out here in good faith, and hopefully it'll be received in good faith. I think that the problem we came to in the computational theory of mind that I just alluded to became the problem of relevance. And people within the computational framework, like Jerry Fodor, right, said you can't account for, and he is a defender of the computational theory. He said, but what the things it can't do is tell you how genuine development, transformational development occurs, because you can't infer a stronger logic from a weaker logic, and you can't get relevance into your computational, logical, mathematical formal system. And I think that's totally right. That's the whole project, the problem of relevance realization. So I see Derrida and Derrida's difference and my relevance realization. I'm not claiming they're identical, but man, could they have a very good conversation with each other. They converge on a lot of things. Now, and then if you move up next to the privileging, right, the idea of, that nominalism is the case, well, you have this weird version of it. You have, again, that there's no transcendent signified, right? There's nothing really beyond or outside the play of symbols, which is nominalism. But then what they do is, right, they do the same thing. They want to privilege a certain kind of sign play as somehow getting us to reality. And this is where many people make critiques. And so what you get is, well, somehow there's the language of ethics, and this is from Levinas ultimately through Derrida, but also I don't want to do too much scholarship. But also you get the privileging of moral discourse. Somehow math isn't the language of reality. Morality is the language of reality. But that doesn't work with all of the problems that you can't sort of deduce, right? So what kind of knowledge is it? Well, it's no kind of knowledge. And you get this weird, you get these weird things where like in Foucault, you're showing the deep interconnections between knowledge, sort of the formal system idea, and power. That's what can't be captured in the formal system, and how they're interdependent with each other. But somehow we can critique this, right? And we can, but because of justice or oppression or the abuse of power, but so somehow these are privileged real patterns, and this is this weird thing. So it basically, how I see it is postmodernism is like modernism, committed to nominalism with the escape clause because if you go pure nominalism, you get pure dualism, pure skepticism, pure solipsism. But the escape cause isn't math, it's morality. But not a morality grounded in anything. It's just like math. It's supposed to be a priori, that we just know that these things are wrong and these things are good.
And that's really interesting, this a priori moral system, which of course someone like Tom Holland comes in and says, well, it did come from somewhere. It came from Christianity. And, you know, that it's interesting, this book I referenced often by sociologist Christian Smith, who in his book Soul Search, he got a series of books where he basically is interviewing American teenagers and asking them about their religious and moral, and for them, again, it's just self-evident, and that self-evidentialism then, you know, combines with, or maybe it's postmodernity manifesting itself through this self-evidentialism. And of course, this ties in with other American philosophical and religious traditions to yield kind of what we have here. I thought this was, I mean, this first part of the video was just astoundingly good. And he was saying these things like, oh, a lot of this stuff makes a lot of sense.
Right.
So
a morality born purely from critique, seemingly.
Yes.
Like it can't get underneath itself, right? It's
it can't get underneath itself, and it can't ultimately situate its normativity within its own practice. So you practice this on behalf of a justice or a freedom from oppression that can't be properly situated within your deconstruction or your archaeology of knowledge, Derrida and Foucault, right? So notice how they are that. So when you have an assumption between two positions that are opposed, that's a presupposition. And we're seeing presuppositions here about logic, knowledge, reality, meaning, and you also have the shared assumption that I don't have to undergo any deep personal transformation in order to get access to these moral truths, right? I just have a method. I do this sort of deconstructive method, right. And then from the epitome of my guilt or something, I then get access to the real patterns of justice and power and oppression. So what I would want to say, if you agree that those three, that the idea of deep truths without deep transformation should be questioned, because that's a shared presupposition. The presupposition of nominalism with the only one privileged way of getting through should be abandoned. That's what I've tried to do with a lot of them trying to bring back Platonism and trying to show the other kinds of knowing is, a deep challenge of that nominalist presupposition. And then finally, a deep challenge of the presupposition that reason is logic. And instead, open up the notion of reason, link it back to transformation, and right. In the notion of wisdom. So that, for me, is what I'm trying to do in... So I take postmodernism very seriously.
Now, just for our listeners, this is a question about non-theism. So we're going to get there. But you might have forgotten. But we are going to get there.
Because I take modernity seriously, and then I try... Wow, this sounds really hubristic. What I'm trying to do, please remember that verb, is I'm trying to get at their shared presuppositions and challenge the shared presuppositions. So I'll let you respond, Nick, before I go on to the second part, which is linking it to the theism and non-theism. And then the third part would be to address the supplementary question.
Right. I mean, I thought that was a wonderful layout of how that development took place. I guess the one thing that kept popping up in my mind is how it seems like we end up in these kind of Gödelian loops. Even within modernism, are we still stuck in this Gödelian loop? And I think that's important because I think a lot of people have a romanticism about modernism as not being in that loop, as being...
Now, a lot of people in the comments were wondering, well, what's that? What's Nick saying that they're talking this It sounds like Gödelian, but it's Gödelian loop. So if you look at Gödel's, and this came up quite a few times in the comment section, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Again, this from Wikipedia. The first incompleteness theorem: any consistent formal system, and again they were talking about formal systems like a chess, which is sort of in self-contained. It needs nothing beyond itself. That's the idea of it. Any consistent formal system F within which a certain amount of elementary arithmetic can be carried out is incomplete. In other words, there are statements of the language of F which can neither be proved nor disproved in F. And you go a little bit later, where's the highlighted portion? Come on. The first incompleteness theorem shows that Gödel's sentence G of an appropriate formal theory F is unprovable in F, because when interpreted as a statement about arithmetic, this unprovability is exactly what the sentence indirectly asserts. Gödel's sentence is in fact true. For this reason, the sentence GF is often said to be true but unprovable. However, and a little bit further, relationship with the liar paradox. Gödel specifically cites Richard's paradox and the liar paradox as semantic analogies of his syntactical incompleteness result from the introductory section of On Formal Undecidable Propositions in Principia Mathematica and Related Systems. The liar paradox is the sentence is false. An analysis of the liar sentence shows that it cannot be true, for then, as it asserts, it is false. Nor can it be false, for then it is true. If Gödel's sentence G for a system F makes a similar assertion to the liar sentence, but with truth replaced with probability, G says G is not provable in the system F. The analysis of the truth and provability of G is a formalized version of the analysis of the truth of the liar sentence. I'm not sure I understand all of this, but this is, I believe, what they're talking about.
Wonderful layout of how that development took place. I guess the one thing that kept popping up in my mind is how it seems like we end up in these kind of Gödelian loops. Even within modernism, are we still stuck in this Gödelian loop? And I think that's important because I think a lot of people have a romanticism about modernism as not being in that loop, as being where we broke.
And that's such an interesting statement by Nix. Romanticism about modernism. Well, what is romanticism? What does he mean by romanticism there? Well, romanticism is sort of this emotion of familiarity, this sort of nostalgia. And if we grew up in this thing, we sort of became accustomed to it. And, we see this in our pets. You have the dog who, if you want your dog to be crate trained, get that dog as a puppy and make sure he always sleeps in the crate. I remember, again, get your cards out, Dominican Republic. I remember in the Dominican Republic, once my son, who was just a little fella, he was just a toddler, and he was running around and always rode in his car seat, unlike every other little boy in the Dominican Republic. Not every other little boy. The missionaries' kids rode in car seats, but, kids were just in the back of pickup trucks and flying around in cars, just like I was when I was a kid. But I remember once I hadn't buckled my son into his car seat yet, and I put the car in reverse to back out of the driveway, and he just he scrambled into that car seat ASAP to lock himself in. And I thought, of course, the only way, for him to ride in a car but not be belted, constrained into this car seat is a little bit of terror. And so Nick's saying that, people have now sort of accustomed themselves to the spirit of modernity, that now there's a romanticism about it, and there's an elevation of it. There's a worship of it.
Free as not being in that loop, as being where we broke free from that loop. So I think it's important. I really love how you tied modernism and postmodernism as basically suffering from the same problem, just switching the area in which it functions. And on the other end, I find it really interesting how you placed postmodernism's kind of pattern recognition in the realm of moral, particularly as we watch postmodernism move ever deeper into the culture and its practice, and how it has started creating seemingly these types of pseudo religions that have
Yes.
and it's interesting, right? Because it's you can see the desire for transformation within those
Yeah.
pseudo religions, but it's so bound in technique, if you will, that it can't actually transform itself. So the right, what's
Now also right there, his relationship between technique and transformation. So in this video that I'm working on, we'll see if it's ever born, about one of the about what is Christianity. There's something in terms of the Enlightenment critique of religion, which is based in Protestantism, because deep in the Protestant reformers was a critique of certain kinds of ritual and practice and a certain formalism that, when Luther critiques the Roman Catholic Church, and this is where I remember listening. I never made a video about it, but I remember first listening to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis and listening to John talk about Luther. And again, I'm no Luther scholar, but I certainly have read Luther, and Luther is a very common object of study in terms of if you're a Protestant clergy. And so I'm not sure. Certainly, nominalism has something to do, has a lot to do with the Protestant Reformation. But I'm not sure Luther is quite the baddie with respect to nominalism as John asserts. But, a lot of what the Protestant Reformation looks at is, in many ways, working from the Hebrew prophets of critiquing the religiosity of the people and finding it shallow. And this gets sort of to the heart of this, ongoing critique that Tom Holland really develops in his work, and you watch him continue to come back to it. And again, it begins in the Hebrew prophets, and Jesus reinforces it, and it comes out again in the Protestant Reformation. It can look like a cynicism sometimes. It's definitely a critique for when the Hebrew prophets, let's say Jeremiah, for example, the people are saying things like, God will not allow the Babylonians to conquer Jerusalem because we have the temple. And Jeremiah says, you're going to play chicken with God. Don't play chicken with God. You're going to lose. And this move of critiquing a certain formalism, it was the sense of, well, I'll smuggle the wafer out of church. I'll smuggle the Eucharist out of church and give it to my cow. And so on one hand, you've got the Roman Catholics elevating and promoting the Eucharist miracles, while this is exactly the point that the Protestants are making all of their hay. And that move is deeply embedded in the Enlightenment critique of religion, and really sets up this dynamic, this externality that John is laying out here, which really seeds the scientific revolution and gets us going. It's in some ways, again, the one-eyed vision of, let's take all of this stuff out and see it through one eye, and we can gain a power that way. And in fact, they do, and it's a very significant power. But you have to open the other eye to actually live, which of course sets up the meaning crisis. So
the final state of the white male is to just endlessly be cycling in his own critique of himself, right? It doesn't actually get, well, and this is perhaps interesting when it comes to theism and non-theism, in the sense that there's a distinct lack of a telos of what that transformation is.
Now, before we get into any telos, I mean, so again, part of the critique of theism, especially if we look at Cudworth, a being, and this is exactly where John's going to go. And again, this is exactly where I remember talking to, maybe I'll still have to work on this, see if I can, Brett Sockold is a busy man, and so, you know, he can't always be available for videos, but I remember talking to him and thinking, boy, I'd love to see him and Vervaeke talk about these ideas, and I still haven't read Nishitani, but all of these ideas of, so let's say, you know, in my work here, following even a Jewish scholar like Kaufman, so, you know, what if my critique of theism is, well, theism is, and again, its timing is suspicious. Theism is late stage deism, where it's merely God number 2 and no God number 1. And again, I became aware of God number 1 and God number 2 when watching Peterson's talk with Brett Weinstein and Sam Harris, because towards the end of that first one in Vancouver, they still haven't gotten around to God, but everybody wants to talk about God. Well, what do you mean? Well, then Jordan Peterson reads out his list of how he understands God. And again, I could recognize that God from reading 16th century reformational pastors, because those descriptions of God were just basically carried over from the medieval period. And then again, connecting that with Brett Sockold's realization that Luther in some ways was trying to get back to Aristotle, but didn't recognize that the shifts underneath the philosophy made Aquinas unreachable. And so his consubstantiation is an attempt at, you know, achieving what Aquinas understood as transubstantiation and what Calvin understood as real presence, but then, of course, Zwingli completely undercuts it with a symbol, but this symbol is in that way simply sort of trapped in a nominalist system. So this of course makes, you know, my conversations with Vervaeke very interesting, you know, given his particular history with Christianity, which he talked about here quite a bit again too. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on underneath, and so again, I'm suspicious of whether Luther is the nominalist baddie that he is often portrayed as being, or if Luther in some ways is trying to get at what he saw, what he feared had been lost by the rampant corruption in the church that at this point almost nobody denies, that there were elements of the Roman Church in Luther's time and in Luther's locale, because locale is important in this. And then, of course, Luther, you know, after Luther sort of sets up the rise of Germany, and that will lead to all sorts of philosophy and culture that will come out of Germany. You know, Luther does sort of set up modernity, and Germany in the 20th century, 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, before the calamitous 2 world wars, you know, will become the epitome of a modern state. It's just all so complex to try to boil down into the sentences that we are left to wield.
And we've spoken about this before, but it seems dangerous, right? We don't want to create a telos that is static. But it seems like we still need a teleological vision that perhaps describes what a optimal state of evolution is, or dynamicness, an optimal dynamicness as opposed to a perfect static.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm torn now between.
Nick was so good, wasn't he?
Replying to that new point, which is a really juicy one,
Sorry.
or still going through. And no. So I'm going to ask you to remember that point and remind me about it, because I want to first. I mean, because we're broaching into the theism, non-theism, and so.
Right.
By the way, I like that this is flowing dialogically. I appreciate that. So thank you. I really appreciate that. It helps me a lot. So I think the thing about theism and non-theism is, let's do first the theism, atheism. So I'm going to try and make a parallel move, right? And the parallel move is a move of, well, what are the shared presuppositions? Because I think it's fair to say, and many atheists actually explicitly say this, that atheism isn't a substantial position, it is merely the negation of theism. And therefore, it's going to be very much analogous how postmodernism isn't something that has a substantial independent content, but is parasitic on modernism. So
you'll hear atheists make this point again and again and again, but it's really hard to live with, because then suddenly they have to. You can't do it, because God is, if you're going to strip God out of the system, he's just in too deep.
If postmodernism ever succeeded, it would disappear because its raison d'etre would disappear.
Right. And this is the point that Pageau makes in his parasitic storytelling video, that that so much of the postmodern attempts at art are parasitic off the modernity.
Right. Same thing with atheism, and I suppose many atheists, that's sort of their utopic vision. So what are the assumptions that are shared by both sides, with one side affirming and the other side negating and locked together? Well, one, and this is going to get us into a debate at some point, and I welcome it, by the way. Paul and JP and I are going to do this, and I welcome this debate. But I'm going to put it aside because I'm going to be responsible to the debate. But maybe I don't have time to do that completely right here. Which is a debate around what do we actually mean by theism. And again, here's another way in which Jonathan Pageau. So Jonathan Pageau is way more radical than people realize. I was asked about this and I thought I'd answer it. Because he's rejecting nominalism at a profound level. He thinks there are real patterns everywhere, as far as I can tell. Right? And they have a life of their own. They have an independent existence to which we have to respond.
See, again, when he says stuff like that, well, what's triggered in me? Well, I'm a Dutch Calvinist. Well, what does that mean? It means if there's anything that the Christian Reformed Church contributed, it is the rigorous worship of the Heidelberg Catechism. And when he says this, I mean, there's in many ways, why I could recognize God in Jordan Peterson's articulation to Sam Harris and what I labeled eventually God number one, or let's call it the Arenic God, is at any moment, if God were to withdraw his hand, the universe would evaporate. Stuff like that in our tradition. And, you might think, well, that's just Vanderklein. No, it's Christian Reformed people who were catechized seriously before the dropping of catechesis in the 80s and 90s know this. This is, and so when I listen to John talk about this and think about Jonathan's patterns and think about what natural theology was for the early deists, they were exploring God when they were measuring gravity. Now think about that. I mean, that language sounds so strange today. They were seeking, because God was in the patterns. Now you've got God number one and God number two, and so then when you get to Cudworth's, A being, you should stop and say, hey, wait a minute. Think about Brett Sockold. God is not something in the system. And yes, Luke, panentheism is a little different. That has its own framing in another way. The system is dependent upon God. In him we live and move and have our being. The whole earth is full of his glory, the arenic God. But God in Christianity, in many ways, and this again from Kaufman in Judaism, the arena has an agency of its own, as it always does. And that was the observation made by Christine Hayes in that lecture from Yale that I've referenced many times.
There are real patterns everywhere, as far as I can tell, right? And they have a life of their own. They have an independent existence to which we have to respond. That makes him much more radical than most of modern Christianity, because modern Christianity, especially Luther is explicitly and deeply influenced by nominalism. Deeply, right? And this has been insinuated into Protestantism, I would say.
And I agree with that it's insinuated into Protestantism. I agree with that. And Protestantism is profoundly impacted by nominalism, but I suspect it's coming in the 17th century and not so much in the 16th century, because I was raised with the Heidelberg Catechism, I could still taste Protestantism before the 17th century. And it's in the 17th century that a lot of this really gets going. And I think it's for that reason that in the 17th century, philosophers are starting to name things in this way.
I welcome Paul's response on this. And it has become
There it was.
pervasive of Christianity through the Counter-Reformation, etc. Eastern Orthodox.
And he's right in terms of the Counter-Reformation. So Luther, and again, I've been reading this book, Reformations. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church has to respond to this. I'll just show you the book I picked up. I'm so excited to get into it. Now I know some of you are going to say, no, Vanderklay, not another book. You don't even have a chance to read all the books you talk about. So Delvin Clay, not Vanderklay, Van Clay, professor of mine at Calvin. It was Calvin College then. Now it's Calvin University. Whose politics many of you would hate. The professor that led me to the rally to protest Ronald Reagan at the Gerald R. Ford Museum. And I'm going to get in trouble with a lot of you for this. And then I remember we had this sign, Reagan lies, are out in Nicaragua. We were talking about that was before, the whole thing, the whole Contra thing blew up. Because I traveled to Nicaragua that year and toured the revolution. And, if you ever have questions about that, I'll tell you some of those stories. But from Calvin to the civil constitution, 1560 to 1791. When I've been talking about the French Revolution, I made the comment that, Germany and the Netherlands and Hungary and Switzerland had Protestant Reformation and Protestant churches. The Reformation tried to get going in France, but it was squashed out when the Huguenots were kicked out. To what degree, because they didn't have Protestant churches, did the French Revolution happen? Now, Dale was on a listserv that he and I both participate in, and so I finally had a chance to ask him that question because he brought up his book and he was quoting from his book. And he basically said, my idea was a thesis, and that's a thesis that he very much addresses and engages in this book. So, John's point here about the Counter-Reformation is, I think, correct. I mean, these ideas, okay, what are these ideas, these spiritual ideas flowed through the world and had to be addressed one way or another, and they were. And, nominalism came to the fore and found religious expression in Protestant and Catholic And so again, John wants to go back to a Platonism, but I have deep questions as to what degree nominalism is built into the science that, he's a scientist. And so, I mean, this is hard stuff. And I just started reading the first few pages of this, and I'm terribly excited about it. But, some of you will say, no, Paul. My wife used to call me Distraction Jackson because, are you going to read propaganda? Or are you going to read, the religious roots of the French Revolution? Well, Ellul's French, right? Good enough? Yes? No?
Orthodoxy, not as it has become Protestantism, I would say, and I welcome Paul's response on this, and it has become pervasive of Christianity through the Counter-Reformation, etc. Eastern Orthodoxy, not as much because it's still tied to Neoplatonism. So that's one way in which Jonathan's more radical. Jonathan's more radical in that he thinks, he said it explicitly publicly, so this is fair, that there's a real possibility that Christianity is going to die and be resurrected into a form that we cannot see.
And of course, Chesterton has basically said the same thing. And I think that is a historical pattern. And in fact, the pattern would be broken if Christianity weren't resurrected. But each time, I mean, Christianity has this way of, I've talked about this in my sermons. I mean, its relationship with culture is so nuanced and complex. It finds shape in lots of different cultures.
Makes him a radical Christian in the way Kierkegaard was a radical Christian, because he sees the death, right? And so we may
very different. Peugeot and Kierkegaard are quite different.
be seeing the death of all of our current understandings of theism. There's a position out there called anatheism, which is what you get after you pass from theism into atheism and then back into something beyond both of them. And I see that as a species of non-theism. And so, by the way,
that's from Nishitani?
Non-theism is not, and anatheism is, I forget who originally put, there's a book, I think it's the anthology's Carey. I may be misremembering, so I apologize if I've miscited. Okay. There's actually a book called Anatheism, which is it's an anthology, okay. I believe. I have it. I haven't had a chance to read it, but anyways. So
he's got the same disease I've got. There's a word for it too. I forget what it is. I'm too busy buying books to remember the word about buying books that you haven't read yet. Then publishers send me books. It's like, oh gosh, what are you doing to me?
And I want to point out that, Paul Tillich, one of the great Protestant theologians of the 20th century, in several places, in one place
and Jonathan Peugeot would say, there are no good Christian theologians in the 20th century. It's certainly not Protestant.
Specifically even titles this way, that his ultimate concern, and that was his definition of faith, is for the God beyond the God of theism, because only the God beyond the God of theism can rescue us from the meaning crisis, because he was worried about the meaning crisis. And so, right, so this is not some strange.
So is Peugeot, well, he's talked before about Tillich, and this is just getting interesting. It's always been interesting, but it's even getting more interesting. It keeps getting interesting.
This is right. Okay, so back to it. Now that
I would argue, just to throw a tiny bit in, I would argue that's attempted to be